Hello, I'm Lisa Speaker. It is May 21st, 2020, and we're here today for our virtual parenting time session for family law attorneys. I have a wonderful panel with me today. Rebecca Schemke is with the Michigan Poverty Law Program in Ann Arbor, and she also is a former chair of the family law section. And 2014, I think, was what we decided the other day.
I think that's about right. Close enough.
Jim Chrysakos is currently on the Family Law Council with me, and he is a family law attorney in Troy and has his own firm. And then Rachel Grutzner is on the amicus committee with me for the family law section, and she just opened her own family law firm this year. What a great year to start your own firm, but I'm like super excited for you. It's Your Path Family Law in Kalamazoo. So we are really excited to share some thoughts about virtual parenting time. And I just wanted to say, as far as introductory comments, I briefed an issue about this many years ago. It was probably 8 years ago, where my client wanted to move out of state, and the trial court denied the move. And one of the arguments we made an appeal, and the Court of Appeals agreed with us. It ultimately was reversed by the Supreme Court for other reasons. But the Court of Appeals agreed with us that one of the things that the parents could do was to have Skype parenting time, which this was pre-Zoom, right? And so at the time, I was advocating for the use of virtual parenting time to make up for the fact that the other parent, the non-custodial parent, wouldn't be able to go to all the school events and have that kind of weekly interaction with the child. Now we're in a pandemic, and a lot of parents who maybe never had virtual parenting time before or never needed it before are getting it for a variety of reasons. So we're going to talk about that. And I think I've, now as a parent as well, I've started to rethink, the use of virtual parenting time. And I think it's obviously better than nothing, particularly if we have parents who just are not able to be together with their children. But I definitely wanted to explore with all of you and our panelists, of course, the role of virtual parenting time. So let's start by talking about the different ways we've seen, like the different circumstances in which we were seeing virtual parenting time. Why would we need to have virtual parenting time? If anybody wants to take the lead of throwing out their thoughts about the instances in which that would occur.
So what I've experienced primarily is clients who have either they are frontline workers, healthcare workers, or their spouse or the other parent is a healthcare worker. And that's primarily where I've been dealing with it. I in fact had a client who is a physician in a clinic who's not a frontline worker, but he voluntarily suspended his parenting time because initially there was a lot of concern, obviously. And then he actually did have a coworker who came down with it, so they had to quarantine for 2-3 weeks. So that's primarily where I've experienced it.
Rachel?
Yeah, so I've seen it in situations where we have a parent who lives out of state. And so in particular, there's some missed parenting time that occurred because the parties would not want a child to take a plane for spring break to the other parent like they typically would have. So I've seen it in that situation. And I've also been seeing it in the case of situations where the parties otherwise would have had in-person supervised parenting time. And so this virtual parenting time has come in to sort of replace that in many ways.
And I definitely want to spend a little time talking about supervised virtual parenting time in a little bit. Rebecca, did you have any other thoughts to share when we're seeing it?
Yeah, nothing much other than to just kind of reiterate what Rachel mentioned, the situation where one parent or the other has supervised parenting time, perhaps supervised at a center. That can't happen anymore because centers are closed. And so what is an alternative? And I guess I've also seen it kind of used against parents. Again, it's sort of in the context of domestic violence, where the abuser wants the survivor to do some sort of accommodation because of what's going on, and the survivor's a little concerned about whether that should be virtual or not.
Got it. I don't think Jim mentioned it. What if your client or one of the parents has been exposed to COVID or has COVID? I think it's some of us are seeing that situation. Fortunately, I have not had too many cases of present themselves to me about that, it's more often they're frontline workers, like Jim said.
Well,
So
the good thing is if they're frontline workers and they're healthcare workers, they're going to be very responsible more times than not. And you're not going to have to go to court. They're volunteering to self-quarantine or do virtual parenting time in the interim. So I've been very fortunate, I guess, in that regard, that I've had cases where I've dealt with it, where they are well aware of the risks and they've volunteered. And I know not everybody's been that fortunate, though.
Great point, Jim. So, I mean, one of the things I'm wondering is it 1-for-1? If you're getting virtual parenting time, is when the crisis is over, when we can go back to normalized parenting time for whatever the reason is that they're not getting normal parenting time now, is the argument going to be, well, you don't really need makeup parenting time because you had virtual parenting time? Have we had any thoughts yet about what's going to happen next once at least if the parenting time is virtual because of the situation we're in right now?
Yeah, that's.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's a great question. I actually, related to my situation with the out-of-state parents, we've been talking about, perhaps the summer parenting should be extended because school is not in session. So when you're out of state, I mean, generally the typical reason that you're not going to have parenting time regularly is because of that school schedule. Well, when the school's not in session and you missed a week because of the spring break and not wanting to fly your child, there's been a, big conversation about doing makeup time, adding it on to that summertime, and then figuring out a way to appropriately transport the child. So, I think it kind of is going to depend on the circumstances of every individual case. And in my particular situation that I'm referencing, I do think that makeup parenting time is possible. I certainly think it would be fair. And I certainly think that there's a good argument that it's, best for the child because they missed out on that bonding time with their parent.
And I do think there's
related. Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think and this is probably what you're getting at, Lisa, is that I think that virtual parenting time certainly is not the same as in-person visit with your child. And so, they're really not comparable. I mean, it's in the situation we're in now, it's kind of like the best we can do in some of these circumstances. And so it seems like when things can go back to normal, whatever that is and whenever that is, then, we would hope that the parenting time that was happening would go back to the usual order. And the issue of makeup parenting time is complicated because on the one hand, the parent is getting some parenting time. On the other hand, it's not the same as what they were used to.
I think I'd be a little concerned about the slippery slope with the makeup parenting time too, because most judges are not going to award makeup parenting time unless in a normal environment, unless the custodial parent denied it for no apparent reason. We don't get makeup parenting time when we can't be there or when we have vacation or we have to work late. It's usually limited situations where the custodial parent didn't permit it and there was no basis for it. So our judge is going to interpret a pandemic as, well, there was a basis for it, so we're not going to open up the floodgates for makeup parenting time motions. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that, but that's going to be a concern for a lot of parents, I think. And
Jim, going to your example of the parent who's a frontline worker who voluntarily gives up their parenting time because they know it's in the best interest of their child for their health, safety, and welfare.
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to be able to go and ask for makeup parenting time because they weren't denied? They gave it up. So I think probably the best thing is if they had an agreement with the other parent, which, that's the big unknown. And then I wanted to go to Rachel's point about the out-of-state parent with why can't they just start the summer time now? And I think that's right, because even if they're remote schooling, they could still remote school with the other parent and give the non-custodial parent a chance to help them with the schoolwork, right? I mean, I don't know if you've had any such motions. I've been approached about a couple motions regarding, wanting to start summer parenting time earlier than normal because everything's virtual anyway, and it doesn't matter what house they're in. Anybody have one of those motions?
I don't, but I believe there's on that topic, isn't there some SCAO directive that talks about, in the context of determining when school ends for the purposes of child support, of parenting time, that judges in front of the courts are encouraged to treat it as though the school were, you know, normally in session. So whatever the normal end date was, that's the date you use. And kind of on the basis that that's what, when the parties presumably negotiated that parenting time schedule, that's what they had in mind. School ends on June 6th, parenting time starts after that.
We actually looked into that issue for a client, and the way that the order and the Supreme Court orders are written about the role of summer parenting time and the end of the school year, it was actually discretionary with the judge. So the rule is school ends when school normally ends. So if your school year ends June 6th, or if the district decides to end it early, which, you know, is happening in some cases, but most are not ending early, that's when your school year ends. You don't get to start your summer parenting time earlier. It doesn't change child support, but it does, the way it's written, and I unfortunately I don't have the language in front of me, it is discretionary with the judge. So the judge has to order something different. That's the rule, unless the judge orders otherwise. So
I think somebody just posted it in the chat.
Oh, excellent. Was that Amy?
Oh, yeah.
And Amy also mentioned the age of the child, and that's definitely one of the topics that we wanted to talk about today. The viability of virtual parenting time, depending on the age of the child, and then, you know, going to frequency and duration. What do you guys think about, you know, what do we do when we have teenagers who may not want to be, you know, hanging out on a monitor with their parents, or very young children who are really too young to interact very much electronically?
Well, I think one of the issues, especially with a very young child, is the need for the custodial parent then to participate in that virtual parenting time, to keep the child engaged, or, you know, make sure the child doesn't, you know, run out, or whatever it is. So I think that requires much more involvement of the custodial parent, and that may not be a good thing for lots of reasons. You know, it may be sort of, the visiting parent may feel like that's infringing on their private time. You know, if there's domestic violence, there could be those safety issues. So that's a real concern with young kids.
Yeah, and the attention span issue as far as young kids is obviously an issue. And I think on some level, parents just have to accept the fact that this is the best we can do in a lot of cases for now, and we can't expect the parenting time to be of the same duration. We were chatting yesterday about it would be nice if there were an ability to with young kids, play games or do something online. And I actually was talking to one of the clients I mentioned, who his former spouse is a nurse on the front line, and she voluntarily suspended her parenting time. And he gave me an app. It's called Together, where you can video conference and play games with each other over video conference. I looked it up and I downloaded it to my phone. So it's called Together. I think it's called maybe Together or Together with Family, something like that. But it's kind of cool for young kids. Parents can exercise some parenting time and try to keep their attention for at least however long. Depends on the age of the child.
Jim, can you put that in the chat so everybody can?
Sure.
Okay. Rachel, did you have anything to add about the age of the children?
Yeah, I was going to raise the possibility of online games and things like that. I see someone in the chat also raised House Party, which is an app if there's an ability for people that have mobile phones to play games together and have a video chat while they're playing those games. But there's even simpler versions of that. You know, there's online Uno games that you can play with your children that they can go on and you can play cards together.
Are you seeing each other's faces when you do that? Or are you just like chatting with each other?
So I believe with the online Uno, you don't see each other's faces, but you can chat with one another. But then, you know, alternatively, you have an option for Zoom, especially if a parent has access to 2 webcams. I know that the East Lansing Public Library has been doing a lot of work like this, where they've been playing Jackbox TV and things like that online with their students and their programs and things like that. So you can set up multiple cams so that you can have a camera that can see the game and then a camera that can see you. So if you have the technology, you definitely can do those things. But I think that, you know, Rebecca's point about, and Jim's point really about how are we acknowledging that this just isn't the same. You know, we all know it's not the same. And I think we all can agree that there's no way that we can expect even a 9 or 10-year-old who does potentially have the ability to sit down and play a game with the parent for 2 full hours. They may just not want to. You know, I think sometimes we forget that, like, this is anxiety producing for the kids too, being cooped up in the house and not being able to see their friends and things like that. So, I mean, I think at this point we all have to kind of be prepared to give each other a little bit of grace, you know?
And I was going to ask the panelists, but if anybody in the audience wants to pipe in, feel free. But has anybody seen virtual parenting time that's been more than like just a couple times a week? Like, I'm thinking with a really young child, you might want to have it 5 times a week for 10 minutes a time. Has anybody seen that? And I don't know if it would be by agreement or court order, because some of the courts have been hard to get into. I'm looking on the chat to see if anybody's responding, but it looks like our panelists have not seen that.
Well,
I haven't. Go ahead.
I have with the virtual parenting time, like multiple times a week. I think I talked about this when we had our discussion in advance of this webinar, but that was, again, from a frontline worker. I really think that the frontline workers are doing a great job parenting with their opposing parties right now, because they are probably the people who understand the risks the most, you know? So in that circumstance, I have seen that parent giving the other parent, you know, multiple 5 days a week, short little interactions with a 5-year-old over, you know, FaceTime. And then they've actually been going and they have been meeting at a public park and taking walks distanced from each other so that they can still see each other. And I'm sure that's really hard for a child not to be able to, you know, run up and hug their parent, but it's a really great way to co-parent right now, you know.
Yeah.
I'm from Kent County, and yesterday I was watching online a permanency planning, and in that case, the agency was kids were in foster care, was voluntarily giving 10 minutes 5 times a week as video with the young children.
And that was through a DHHS
Yes.
order? Okay.
Oh, it was how they adapted. I don't know if it was the agency or DHHS.
And I'm going to call on, thank you, Terry. I'm going to call on Lisa Kurshitawa as well. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, there we go. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hello. There have been 2 different policies that have come out through DHHS during all of this. The first one completely suspended all in-person parenting time. It didn't matter what stage of reunification the families were. The case that is kind of near and dear to me was a 2.5-year-old who was removed from the parents on the day he was born from the hospital, and they now had him home for 5 of 7 days and nights when this happened. And then unsupervised, like, yeah. Return home, like, we are home free here. And then all of this happened, and they put him in foster care with virtual visits. And we had court order after court order after court order, and DHHS was sticking to their policy, no exceptions. About like the middle of April, I want to say, their next policy came out, which does have a provision that defers to court orders, where the first one was like strict, this is our rule, this is what we're doing, we don't care what you say, judge. And but that case, we were able to, even though when we couldn't get it back, you know, I didn't win initially on my emergency motions to have the child, you know, quarantined with his parents. He was quarantined with his foster parents and the other children, And, but they did have, it was supposed to be an hour a day, every day, virtual parenting time, but he's 2.5. So, you know, he was like, you know, 45 seconds and done. So what the parents did, and I think that these are really, you know, great ideas. They gave some of the toys that he liked to play with at their house, like he loves trucks. So they kept some trucks at their house, and they had the foster care worker take some of the trucks to the foster home. And then they would like do stories with the trucks, and he'd be kind of playing with them on his side and the parents on their side. And they did that like with some painting, just, you know, to just trying to keep him in front of the screen for more than a minute. And then, you know, we did do a motion in April, and the judge sent him home to his parents. So we're out of that situation now, but it really took a lot of creativity and a lot of patience. And, you know, he had a great foster mom that was really pro birth parent, which I'm not, in most situations, we don't have that. So that was unique about it too.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Lisa. And Melissa Calais has an experience where she was on a case where there was an order for frequent virtual parenting time. Melissa, can you share that with us?
Yeah, I had a client approach me before all of this started that we were planning on filing a motion to modify parenting time. I represented dad, mom wasn't really getting the kid to school, and some other issues were going on. But then right before the first stay-at-home order, mom kind of used COVID-19 as an excuse to prohibit dad from having any parenting time or any contact with the child. Not a frontline worker, no reason to think child would be at risk. And again, before the stay-at-home order. So we got an emergency order to get the child removed. But one of the things I think helped in that situation was that I specifically included in there a provision that mom can still have daily contact with the child because she was able to do that by phone or video safely. And I think that was one of the reasons that helped get that granted in that particular situation.
Thank you, Melissa. Now, have any of our panelists or audience members had an experience with there being frequent virtual parenting time for the purpose of helping the child with schoolwork while we're doing the remote learning? Has that come up at all? Not from our panel, it looks like. Okay. Well, one of the things, go ahead.
Well, I can say I have a situation where, I mean, you know, this really depends, obviously, with absent court orders, and we've all been dealing with courts that are opened at varying degrees, right? Because there's no uniformity, and some of us obviously less early on, and now more court contact as we've all kind of adjusted. But you know, when you're dealing with an opposing parent or the other parent who isn't willing to facilitate anything, you might have a parent who wants to engage in that kind of situation and to be able to help, but they haven't been able to. And so, you know, I have a particular situation where it's really just one of those awful situations that, you know, you wish never happened, but it does. And so a client who doesn't have a specific parenting time schedule following entry of an ex parte order, it's not specific, and that it's totally controlled by the other parent. And so of course the other parent is not permitting anything whatsoever in this interim time. And so, you know, to stay connected to the children and to stay involved in their schooling, my client gets the emails from the school, and so she joins the Zooms for the school, and she sees what the teachers are doing with the kids. And, you know, she does that without video because she doesn't want to distract her children since they haven't seen her in months and months and months. But for her, it's an opportunity to see her children on the video, and it's also an opportunity to remain involved in their schooling.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Terrence Hall mentioned grandparents getting time, and I don't think he's referring to a grandparenting time order, but just, you know, by being a grandparent. And it's interesting because the comments that he made on the chat are very similar to what Shelley Wine was talking about back when we did our creative parenting time solutions. I think it was the second week of the shutdown, so it would have been our second webinar. Shelley Wine is a parenting investigator or conciliator with the Oakland County Friend of Court, and she was one of our panelists, and she's a grandparent, and she's talked about how she was spending a lot of time on Zoom playing games and reading stories and whatnot with her grandchildren, which of course, you know, when it's not by court order, that's just nice that you have a relationship with the parents in the household that you can do that. But it's still a really good point that it can be used for not just parents, but other family members. And presumably if you have a grandparenting time order that you're not able to exercise would be the same thing.
The other thing I just wanted to, if I can just jump in, you know, this is a good time to have a parenting coordinator in a case because we have varying degrees of access to the courts right now.
So Jim, before you get too far, because not all counties are as familiar with the role of a parenting coordinator. So I would like to hear your comment, but can you first just lay out what a parenting coordinator does? And because Oakland County, I think, is more familiar with the concept than some other places around the state.
Yeah, I think somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. We did pass the parenting coordinator statute. I don't know how many years ago it was it 4 or 5 years ago, maybe more than that. It does require a degree of training. I'm not a trained parenting coordinator, but I've got cases where they've been appointed. In the case I'm dealing with, it was actually appointed by an arbitrator. Generally, I would say high conflict cases where maybe we're not quite ready to appoint a guardian ad litem, and we also don't want the parents having to spend money to go to court every 2 weeks, which may be necessary in some of these cases. So we have a parenting coordinator who can either be a mental health professional or an attorney. And they can, much like a GAL, you know, they'll try to mediate the disputes. They'll discuss with each parent what the dispute is, usually regarding parenting time, and make a recommendation. And generally speaking, the order entered appointing that parenting coordinator will say that their recommendation will take immediate effect unless superseded by a court order or objected to. And that's the beauty of it right now, is with limited access, I suppose, which side of the lens you're on, that may be beautiful and may be terrible, but it's good to have an immediate decision or prompt decision if you're in one of these counties that, I know we talked about it yesterday, there are a couple counties at least that we know of that are very slow to video conference hearings. So my experience right now is I'm dealing with a parenting coordinator and it's been a godsend.
Thank you, Jim. So I know.
And I see Matt Katchik just posted the statute for us.
Thank you, Matt. All right, Katchik.
On the ball as always, man.
I know that Washtenaw has been slow to move to Zoom hearings. I think St. Joe County, I think Kent's been a little slow, but it might be judge dependent. If you guys have if the audience members have other counties that have not yet jumped on having Zoom hearings in lieu of not having hearings at all, feel free to put it in the chat just to share the content with other people in the audience. And I know, I think we talked about this last week when Judge McCarthy was with us, but Wayne County didn't do any hearings for almost 2 months except for emergency hearings. But starting May 11, they're doing everything via Zoom until the end of the year is the plan. So all hearings, motions, and evidentiary hearings. So they were a little slow to get started, but once they're like full steam ahead, and the judges and court staff and everybody's working a lot of hours right now, I think. One thing I wanted to talk about is supervised parenting time, and I know Rebecca brought it up earlier, but I'm involved with, or have heard of many cases from multiple counties where a parent, you know, had the unfortunate situation of having supervised parenting time, and switching that to supervised virtual parenting time has created some problems and difficulties. And I certainly have a list of things that I can share. But I was going to turn to Rebecca to start with about some of the problems that we have with the supervised virtual parenting time.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Lisa. So, you know, I think when we were chatting among ourselves yesterday, we were talking about supervised parenting time. And I think the first thing is you got to look at why is a parent's parenting time being supervised to begin with. Is it because of domestic violence? Is it because there's some substance abuse or mental health issues that create some issues in terms of that parent's interaction with the child? Is it just that a parent has not had very much contact with that child and this is kind of the slow introduction? So, so I think that's the first thing. And then is there a way to, so So I think one of the problems is if the supervised visitation was being supervised at a center, and we've got one in Washington, I know other counties have supervised visitation centers. Those, my understanding is those centers are pretty much shut down and are not doing any remote or any in-person visitation for obvious reasons. So
the same thing I know we've had in the chat about DHHS. So regardless of whether it's a family law case or a child protective proceeding, any kind of supervised facility has been completely shut down, I guess. At least, when is it going to open up? I don't know. That's another part of the conversation. So anyways,
right. So, you know, so I think if you're considering the reason for the supervision, then you've got to think about, well, is there a way to transition from that supervised, however it was, to some other form of visitation that's going to keep the same protections in place? And I think that's the really tricky part. And so, I mean, I'll just sort of talk briefly about what I know, which is when there's supervised visitation because of domestic violence. If you're going to talk about moving that to virtual parenting time via Zoom or Skype, there can be real safety concerns, particularly for that abused parent, because now the supervision is kind of brought into her house or his house. The children are going to be on that parent's computer, presumably, and in that house. And how much interaction is she going to have to facilitate that parenting time between the abusive parent and the child? And
in this scenario, you're talking about the parent who is now remote is the victim. Is that the example you're giving?
No, I'm sorry. The example is the person whose visitation was supervised was the abusive parent. And so now we're looking at whether that abusive parent's parenting time can move from a supervised center to a remote kind of a situation.
So, so one of the problems with that scenario, hypothetically, would be if there was verbal or emotional abuse, right? You can't have the children engaging with the parent without supervision, because we have to be able to, I think it's where you're going. We'd have to be able to jump in and make sure if something inappropriate started to happen verbally, that we've got to shut that down, right?
Right, because one of the benefits of having, or the reasons for having supervised parenting time is so that there's a third person there who can step in when something's inappropriate, whether it's verbal abuse of a child or a parent, trying to question the child about the other parent's life. But that you can't really do with virtual, because the only other person there usually is going to be that other parent, and that it's not fair or safe for that parent to kind of supervise those kind of visits.
Well, and also because in your example, the custodial parent who has the children is potentially also the victim of the domestic abuse.
Right.
So there's the additional, not just what is that the abusive parent going to say to the children that could be harmful or inappropriate, but could that abusive parent use the opportunity to, cause more harm to the ex-spouse or whatever the case may be.
Right. And just using, the abusive parent can use that sort of virtual contact to kind of further harass and control the survivor. Right.
And I don't know if it makes a difference then if the non-custodial parent is the victim and the custodial parent is the one that has the abusive history. I'm not sure the dynamics change. It's just that the non-custodial parent is going to have their parenting time supervised by the person who abused them.
Right. So I think some of the same dynamics can be there. Certainly. Right.
Yeah, I was definitely going to say, and I think it's in line with the comment that Amy Lindholm just put in the chat, which is asking whether everyone's seeing their supervised parenting time centers fully closed. What a great opportunity for people who provide parenting time supervision services to offer it virtually, to supervise parenting time over Zoom. They can host that meeting and they can control whether the other parent is going to continue to have that contact with the child, because they can observe what the other parent does.
Right, and I'll say that I know Washtenaw County's Supervised Visitation Center, I don't know if anybody from my office is on this webinar, but we had, one of our attorneys had a client who had supervised visitation I think the abusive parent had supervised visitation at the visitation center, and there was some communication about whether they could offer some sort of virtual parenting time. They ended up not doing it, and I didn't get a clear answer about whether and to what extent they are providing that. But I agree with Rachel, and I've seen some information from centers across in other parts of the country that have set up a pretty robust virtual parenting time program through the supervised visitation centers.
So when we're using a center to do the supervised virtual parenting time, can they then insist that the custodial parent just leave the room so that the non-custodial parent has, one-on-one supervised parenting time, but without the interference of usually what the case is, it's a former spouse. So without the interference of the former spouse, whether that spouse is a victim or abuser or none of the above, can they require, what controls are there to protect the parent and the children in this space, which is now the virtual parenting time?
Right. I think that's a great question. I don't really know the answer to it. You would think that if the supervised center is going to be doing the supervising virtual parenting time, they'd want to try and recreate that experience as much as possible.
Again, this is where I'm sorry, you go ahead and finish.
No, I was just going to say, and that would include making sure that other parent wasn't present, because that's part of what happens in the centers. Go ahead.
Again, this is where the age of the child is so relevant. If you're talking about a child 10 and up, it's probably a non-issue. If you're talking about young children, how are you going to tell the other parent to leave? That child has to be engaged.
Right.
So.
It may not be practical. Amy Lindham asked a question about whether there needs to be more guidance from SCAO about supervised parenting time. I'll let the panelists answer for themselves, but I think the answer is yes, because we have had some guidance on parenting time, but there's not been very much at all, if anything, about supervised parenting time, which is, creating a lot of issues for those families that haven't been able to exercise any, meaningful parenting time at all. And even the supervised parenting time is not as good as it normally would be. Rachel, Jim, Rebecca, do you want to add anything else? I think maybe SCAO wants to hear from us. So do we have a wish list? Put it up in the chat if you're in the audience.
I would agree. I think SCAO does need to provide some additional guidance. I think things are getting a little better because we're moving into more open courts, and things will continue to get better. But I think when this first started, SCAO's advice was just follow the orders, which is great. But if you've got supervised visitation and a center's closed, or we had a client who had to, or someone contacted me about a client who had to get drug screens before visitation, and those centers were all closed. I think we need some guidance to say, okay, sure, you follow the order, but if the order absolutely can't be followed, then what happens? And then, because I think what you're left with is the situation where parents are trying to negotiate and work things out, and that just doesn't usually happen when one parent's visitation is required to be supervised. Negotiation probably isn't necessarily going to be effective.
I guess my question would be, I don't know how much input they can have on these private organizations. You have these nonprofits that provide these services most of the time. We have Care House of Oakland County, Impact Services are the ones that come to mind. Just because SCAO implements these guidelines, that doesn't automatically make these nonprofits capable of doing virtual parenting time.
Right. Well, that's a good point, but it might help the parties and potentially, if you need to bring a motion to a judge to have a modification of the schedule, and that would be a motion under CABE v. CABE has the lowest threshold, so you should easily be able to satisfy that threshold to get some sort of modification during the pendency of the crisis. I would hope.
Yeah, I'm all for more guidelines from SCAO. I just wonder how at the ground level, how much impact is it going to have?
Well, and even if SCAO were to indicate that these kind of motions are, considered emergency motions, or should have should be heard by courts, so that courts aren't just saying, well, this is an emergency, we don't need to hear this.
Oh my gosh, Rebecca, that is an excellent point, and that's a situation I have seen where we've had attorneys around the state filing motions, but there's certain counties that we're only hearing emergencies. And I think that's starting to change now that we're over 2 months into this.
Right.
But they were saying a lot of most everything was an emergency. So even though we're holding hearings and we're doing hearings, but only on emergencies, but nothing's an emergency. Or, you know, that's the perspective I've heard of, at least from the trial attorneys. Rachel, I wanted to ask you, and I think Rebecca mentioned recording the virtual parenting time session. Did you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, you know, we definitely, I think, all have different feelings about recording parenting time, but one sort of discussion was whether recording the virtual parenting time might be a way to replace supervision or a way to assist, you know, a parent who is the custodial parent that is the victim of domestic violence or survivor of violence, to be able to show to a fact finder later, you know, this is why this can't work, because this is how this person is engaging with me. And I certainly have had clients do that in the past, even prior to COVID, to within the confines of the law, you know, record their conversations with the opposing parent. And so and to some success with trial courts. And I know that there was, you know, Jim had a lot to add about what he sees and how, you know, judges kind of deal with that. And so I think I want to kind of kick it to him to talk about that a little bit further, but I certainly see that as an opportunity here.
Well, I've just always had bad experiences whenever I had a client try to record conversations. It's a lot easier now if it's virtual as opposed to when they're going through a divorce living together. What I was mostly concerned about when we had our talk yesterday, I agree, there's no issue with one parent recording a conversation, especially now over phone or Zoom with the other parent. But I want to make sure parents and we as attorneys are mindful of the eavesdropping statute, that if you are not a part of the conversation, that if this is just the parenting time between the other parent and the child, we still have the eavesdropping statute. And there actually is a bill currently out there that would permit a parent to eavesdrop on a conversation with the other parent if they believe that there is a risk of domestic violence or the well-being or safety of the child is at risk. That's actually a pending bill in the Senate. That's Senate Bill 463 from Senator Lucido, who introduced the exact same bill a couple of years ago, and it ended up dying in committee. But right now, that's not the law. The law is still that you cannot eavesdrop on a child's conversation with the other parent. Although I know when we debated this bill in council a couple of years ago, it was pretty widely acknowledged that a lot of parents would do that if they had a concern about the well-being of their child, even if it were against the law. So it's a sensitive issue. You just want to be mindful of the eavesdropping statute if you are not a part of the conversation and it's just parenting time between parent and child.
That's an excellent point. If the custodial parent is not supposed to be the supervisor, it's just virtual, not unsupervised virtual parenting time, they really shouldn't even be probably in the room. So they wouldn't have the ability to record, or they could, but not legally. Couple of things about recording. So we all know it's really easy to record on Zoom. So, but you can obviously, everybody can see there's a button, right? You can see that this is being recorded right now. So the parent, if you're doing it via Zoom, that everybody's going to know, and she'd want to make sure they're okay with that if it was an issue, if they're not going to be in the room. Or if they're using their phone just to record the conversation, just to have some sort of evidence, but the same issues that Jim raised. The other thing is, and we talked about this the other day, about getting a transcript from a Zoom recording. And I think not just Zoom does this, but other platforms as well, like Skype. But we went ahead and looked into it because I had not ever obtained a transcript from a Zoom recording. I've looked at the chat after the fact, I've watched the recording after the fact, but I haven't actually obtained a transcript. Well, if you have a paid subscription, apparently, and it can be the lowest level paid subscription, every recording is transcribed automatically, and you just have to log into your system, and it's one of the things you can grab. You can go get your recording, you can go get your transcript. So if there is issues, obviously getting past the recording, that it's okay to record it in the first place, it's really easy to get a transcript of it for purposes of, I don't know, showing your attorney or whatever, or the attorney to show the court. But yeah, there's a lot of issues with that. So do we have any more thoughts about supervised parenting time to help out SCAO?
I think that we have a comment in the chat here that asks a good question. So we've got a change in our executive orders today, and I haven't even had the opportunity to review them.
I started to, but they were really long.
Yeah, I can only imagine that now we're allowed to have gatherings of over 10 people, although my understanding, I think, was that you still have to distance during those gatherings. So that's a good question.
Yeah.
And what did you say? And
mask.
mask?
Yeah,
okay.
All of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a good question of, is it better to have a socially distanced, masked, supervised parenting time visit or something like that, rather than have a virtual parenting time visit?
Okay, so here's the thing, Rachel. So let's just use the hypothetical of somebody that's only been in getting supervised parenting time, right? The Supreme Court told us that parenting time orders can be followed even in the pandemic. So if they were getting regular parenting time, let's just say if it went on, then child is moving from one house to the other, they're actually within close proximity to the other parent. Okay, so let's use switching it to supervised parenting time. Now there's a supervisor. So maybe now some of the centers will make it accessible because a center could supervise with having the 6 feet distance. I don't think a parent should be prohibited from, let's just use the example of hugging your child. If they're, obviously it's not going to be less, it's going to be less than 6 feet, but maybe they're wearing a mask. But if they're allowed to have parenting time per the Supreme Court, then why can't they have, as long as they have a supervisor that's obeying the law, why can't the parent and the child be right next to each other during that supervised parenting time session?
I agree.
That's how I feel about it.
I agree with you. I think that they probably could, but perhaps that's something that we would ask SCAO to give us some guidance on.
Yeah, and because these orders are coming out every week, and every week it's like things are slowly changing, and I think, and I know, Rebecca, you wanted to say something, but I did try to do a quick read. It was really, really long, but it said groups of 10. It did say throughout the state, but then there was all these restrictions. So like we can't go to restaurants yet unless we're in region 6 or 8, but I think we can be in groups of 10 if we're socially distanced and have appropriate masks. So I think that applies to the whole state. Matt, are you agreeing with me? Katchik, you're making faces. Is that, yep, I got it. Okay, good. Rebecca?
I was just going to point out in response to what you were saying, Lisa, about a parenting time order allows the parents to be in contact with each other. It's almost like just a problem of all these conflicting orders. You've got, a parenting time order from the trial court says you can have parenting time with your child. We've got the Supreme Court saying parenting time orders are still enforceable. And then you've got all the executive orders that say everyone has to stay 6 feet apart. So I don't know, sounds like a bigger legal issue than I'm willing or able to tackle.
Right, 6 feet apart if you're not a member of the same household. So then the question is, if you're a parent that only has supervised parenting time, are you a quote member of the same household? I mean, maybe that's the question. I don't know the answer. Yeah, I don't want to give improper legal advice.
That does seem like a very narrowly tailored question that perhaps SCAO could answer, right? Yeah. When are you defined as a member of the same household?
Do we have any thoughts about how virtual parenting time might change, or whether the virtual parenting time will be used more after we get past the pandemic? Are people going to be more willing to do it as a supplement to the regular parenting time? Because now people are really getting used to this idea of using Zoom or Skype or whatever WebEx platforms they're using. Most people are using Zoom. I wish I had bought stock in Zoom in January. Do we have a feeling about how we're going to be viewing virtual parenting time? How are the courts going to view it?
I don't think it's going to be a substitute for parent. I think what you'll see is in lieu of phone calls, a lot of parents do a nightly or every other night when it's not their parenting time, the phone call. But if you live in close proximity, and unless you're in a danger group, risk group, I think it could be a substitute for phone calls. I think we just are more aware of Zoom and the options through video conferencing and virtual parenting time now than we were 2 months ago. A lot of people were just slow to the party and doing regular phone calls, which is fine, or text messages. But I think this is going to supplement that, but not the actual parenting time, in my view.
Yeah,
unless something changes health-wise.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I do think it could be, I mean, I feel like everyone's getting so used to these kind of Zoom conversations, whether it's this kind of a meeting or, meeting with your family that you can't otherwise do, that I think maybe it might become supplemental to whatever parenting time a parent is having, especially when parents live far away or there are other kind of limitations short of safety issues on the parenting time. So I could see a parent saying, well, okay, sure, I know I have to have limited in-person contact, but why not just add on to that some Zoom contact every other day? So I could see that happening, just like I think courts are becoming so much used to, Zoom hearings, that courts like Wayne County are kind of saying this could be the wave of the future, for better or worse, and in my view, mostly for worse, but.
I like the points that we're seeing on the chat about the use of FaceTime and Skype that we had before the pandemic. And I don't have an iPhone, so I didn't use FaceTime, but I used Duo, which is probably not as good of an app, but I think I like Zoom better. I don't know, like it's similar, and it's better to, I think, see faces, even if you can't really make direct eye contact. You certainly can't make direct eye contact on FaceTime either, I don't think.
Well, and to be able to do it from your computer or a tablet, I guess tablets you could do FaceTime too, but it's just, yeah, I agree with the comment that it has been bigger for professional work settings, but I just think it's more in the public consciousness now.
Right. And I think the kids today, I mean, it's obviously different 20 years ago, but kids today are so comfortable with devices. And I don't know what age that begins as. Elizabeth Sadowski shaking her head. I don't know what age that begins with. I mean, I've seen little kids, 18 months old, 24 months old, on tablets, playing games. But like, at what age are they really like very comfortable? I mean, I would think even by 4 or 5, they're pretty comfortable being on a device. It's just for them. It's just as natural as anything.
Well, and now they're doing daily or weekly, but mostly daily Zoom calls with school.
Yeah.
So kids from kindergarten on up are going to be very familiar with Zoom and the comparable options for video conferencing now.
Yeah, and I think what we're probably going to see maybe at our next wave is, and I'm sure this has already been a problem, but I wonder if it's going to be heightened in its importance, is a question of, who's paying for these devices for the children between parents who are separated, or alternatively, at what age are we going to permit our child to have their own device? And maybe now courts are going to say, maybe a 5-year-old can have an iPad, because maybe a 5-year-old can use it for Zoom, conversation with their other parent, and maybe that's appropriate. I don't know.
Or the 5-year-old doesn't need an iPad or an iPhone, because if you're using, for example, Zoom, you can just get on any laptop or computer and do it and just sit them down. Like, you don't have to give them a phone necessarily. Although I would imagine that, I'm guessing, I have no data to support this, but for children of divorced parents, that more of them proportionally probably have cell phones at an earlier age to make it easier to communicate. I don't know that for sure, but that's just kind of an instinct that I have, especially if you're going to have like a daily call or every other day call. It's going to be a little bit more difficult if you have to call your ex-spouse first.
And I just want to also, this is a good time to just kind of mention that there are issues for some parents that just can't afford all these devices, whether for themselves, let alone for themselves and their child. And so I think we really have to be mindful of that. Or, parents in some of the rural communities that just have terrible access to Wi-Fi through no fault of their own. Or have, limited English language skills and have some, issues with the technology. So I think we have to be mindful of all that when we're talking about sort of the new age of virtual everything.
Well, and I know schools were cooperating with families to provide devices for families who don't have access to that.
Right.
Some schools, maybe not all
Right.
schools.
Right.
If anyone suggests a low-cost parenting time app for low-income parents.
So I can recommend, actually not an app, but what I have done in many cases for people who cannot afford the, our Family Wizard or Two Houses or whatever, is that the parents each create their own dedicated Gmail address. Stacy's mom 1@gmail.com, Stacy's dad 1@gmail.com. And that is the only purpose of that email address is to communicate with the other parent. And that is the platform where they exchange bills, where they exchange schedules. There is a calendar function through Gmail, which is free, right? So they share just that calendar with one another, and it gives them a calendar function just like Wizard. It's not nearly as good, but it's an option.
Isn't there a Google Hangout that's available that's also free?
Yes, and Google
Kids
Hangout.
are using it for school. They're having they're having like their classes meeting there a couple times a week for Google Hangouts.
And somebody had asked, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say Google Hangouts has been around for, 10 years, if not more. I mean, I used to do it with, friends when I was back in law school. So, I mean, it's been around for a long time. It's definitely a good option for people who maybe can't afford the subscription cost to Zoom, because I'm sure, people on this chat might not be aware that if you don't pay for Zoom, you get kicked off if you're the initiator of the meeting after 40 minutes.
Right.
Right.
So you only get a 40-minute meeting for free. So.
And I know that app that I had mentioned earlier, Together, is a free app. And then I saw somebody had a comment asking if our Family Wizard had a virtual parenting time feature. I'm not aware of them having that, unless I'm wrong.
The other thing I just wanted to...
They're going to probably.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe this time next year they'll be introducing
coming down the road soon.
Right.
I just quickly wanted to mention our Family Wizard does provide scholarships to parents, so they can get free access for a year, and they're renewable. And I've done that for many clients, especially if they're low income. And I know I just have to say they qualify for legal services, for legal aid under the federal poverty guidelines, and it's simple and easy, and they get their free access like the next day.
Well, wonderful. I wanted to thank our panelists for providing so much helpful insight today, and hopefully we can get some more guidance down the road from SCAO. So this is, I think, the 8th webinar in a row we've done since March 27th. I'm taking off 2 weeks from webinars. I'm not on vacation. I just have a lot of other work to do. 2 weeks of no webinars, and then we're coming back on June 11th. I know, Matt. Okay, maybe you want to be on panel. He's like getting so excited. Mad or happy? I can't tell. Okay, so there's a couple of topics. So I guess if you can email me or put it in the chat if you have ideas for topics. I know we want to revisit child support, and I see Erin Magley looking at me right now. So at some point when she was on my child support panel, so I think we're definitely going to revisit that. I'm not sure if June 11th is too early for that. We need to have more people being able to get back into courts and getting back to work before they start modifying. So maybe later, I'm not sure yet, but maybe later in the summer for child support. I really think that people want to revisit the evidentiary hearings via Zoom, because it seems like a lot of counties, even as we're opening back up, a lot of counties are going to be using that as an option for quite a while. But if you have any other ideas, I'd love to hear them. I was thinking maybe domestic violence issues specifically for this pandemic period. Because it's going to still be a while before we're all back to normal, especially now that the state is divided into 8 zones. Region 1 is like 6 or 7 counties, which includes Oakland, Wayne, Macomb, I think Livingston, Genesee, Lenawee. I mean, it's like a pretty big area. And I feel like as we're transitioning back to normal life, it's going to be a lot longer for Region 1 than it is going to be for a lot of the other regions. So I don't know what's going to happen. It's just going to be longer for the courts to get back to normal and everything else to normalize anything can normalize before this vaccination, I guess is my point. So anyways, I want to thank all of you for coming again. It has been fun. And Elizabeth Sadowski raised her hand.
Oh, I just
Yes,
want
ma'am.
to be, yeah, I just had a comment to make with respect to make-up parenting time. I think we should be conscious of the fact of taking into consideration the viewpoint of a child. A child who has been in the environment of a parent for a prolonged period of time should not be treated like an end table or grandma's ashes and just put in suddenly thrust into a whole new different prolonged environment simply to make up parenting time. A child is not an object or a number. So I think we should take into consideration that fact before we, in considering make-up parenting time. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
And that may be another thing that the SCAO, we want their input on, and guidelines is guidelines for make-up parenting time during this period.
Mhm.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to be starting to see those motions. I would say, I think they're going to be coming in June and July, and there's going to be a lot of motions, and I think a lot of hearings via Zoom, right, Rachel?
I do think so.
Well, at least it'll save some drive time, right?
That's true. It's true.
You can be in Kalamazoo at 2 o'clock and Ingham County at 3.
That's right. Or you can be in a mediation until 12:59 and at court at 1. That's what I did this morning. So I'm
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to stop the recording, and then if anybody has last comments, we can do that. Pause, stop.